Namaste and welcome everyone to our special webinar on Dharma and justice. You know, I'm Ankur Patel, Director of Advancement for Hindu University of America. We've been doing these webinars every week for over 2 years now. And it's an honor to have our panelists today, Dr. Indira Vishwanath and Dr. Jenna Murray, to elaborate on the popular debate about social justice. And if you can, put in the chat where you are zooming in from. I know everyone has a different perspective on this, and hopefully we can get into that. From Toronto, Canada to everywhere around the world. Charleston, West Virginia. Welcome Kishore from Durham, North Carolina. Madhuri G from Anil Garg from New Delhi. San Jose over here. Aloha from Maui. Jeffrey, thank you for joining us. Yeah, just put in the chat where you are zooming in from. People will be joining us. It's always interesting and exciting. And that's part of what we're here to do, right? Get different perspectives on this important issue and getting away from the extreme polarities, right? The polarization that's happened around all of our rhetoric and language. And it often gets silenced or ignored is the process and the range of constructive critiques about social justice, as well as frameworks of duty, right action, and justice embodied by mature Dharma traditions. So in this webinar, you're going to hear some thoughtful insights on social justice from the Jewish American perspective and Hindu American perspective, from scholars of teacher education. I'm also a teacher, and I'm very curious about this to see how this plays out. And of course, we have Jennas Vishwanathan, President of Hindu University of America. Let me hand it to him after I give Dr. Indira Vishwanathan. Oh man, I love Dr. Induji, your work. I was chatting with you like the feminine incarnation of the Hindu academic perspective, right? She's representing it so powerfully. If you don't follow her on Twitter, you should. She's prolific on so many issues. She's bringing to bear our perspective, at least I feel my perspective, and I think our perspective. And her research focuses on the transnational consciousness of second-generation Indian American teachers. She herself is a second-generation Hindu American, raising third-generation Hindu American children. In addition to having experienced how Hinduism is taught in American schools, barely it is, right? And wrongly usually. As a student and now as a mother, she's also keenly aware of how the narrative about Hinduism as it relates to the issues of social justice is controlled by a small group of influencers who do not seem open to scholarly liberal dissent or any kind of real conversation. But Induji is committed to adding more voices to the conversation. That's what we're doing here, and bringing Dr. Jenna Murray into this. She is a mother herself, a scholar, and a visiting assistant professor at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Her research considers questions of teacher activism, teacher preparation to combat white supremacy and hatred, and the possibilities of combining post-humanism and critical whiteness in curriculum studies and teacher education. So those are our two panelists. Let me hand it to President of Hindu University of America, Sri Kalyan Vishwanathan, who is going to give us some more context. Kalyanji, you don't need an introduction. You're running this ship. Let me hand it to you.
Okay, wonderful. Great, Ankur, thank you so much. And a very warm welcome to all the participants in this webinar. We have about 80 people here. And of course, a very warm welcome to Dr. Jenna Murray and Dr. Indira Vishwanathan. Thank you for joining us this morning. Now, I want to begin by framing this conversation in a very personal sort of way, which is, I believe through many, many years of learning, I have a good understanding of the polarity between Dharma and Adharma as articulated within the Hindu world, the Hindu tradition. And the polarity between justice and injustice also has a kind of a natural resonance with this idea of Dharma and Adharma, justice and injustice. Okay. However, I am not entirely at home with the translation of these ideas. Sometimes I honestly get a little troubled by the way justice is being deployed in a particularly harsh and even a kind of a weaponized sort of way. So I just want to place that as the context as we get into this conversation. And of course, to the Hindu world, Dharma and Adharma are not unknown. Every Shastra, every Purana, every Itihasa, every text goes on and on and on about Dharma. It's a centrality of Dharma. In fact, our tradition itself is called Sanatana Dharma, meaning this Dharma that is eternal, indestructible, and so on. But today we are going to see where the parallels are with this notion of justice, injustice, social justice warriors, of course, and its aftermath, the cancel culture, and all of this that has emerged in the wake of this. Okay, so before we get into the subject matter, I'd like to invite Dr. Jenna Murray to briefly introduce yourself. Say a little bit about your journey, how you chose to become a teacher and a teacher educator, what led you to it, and then we'll go to Dr. Indu. Jenna, please.
Thank you very much, Kalyanji, for having me here. And thank you to Indu as well for inviting me. And thank you for everyone who's in the audience for being here to listen. I'm really excited to learn with and from all of you. So I became a teacher because I felt that that would be a way to make the world better. And from a very young age, I was brought up in my tradition with a very, very particular Hebrew phrase that is tzedek, tzedek tirdof, which means justice, justice you shall pursue. And I was kind of led to believe that this meant that I should be working to make the world better, and going with another sort of phrase that kind of guided me, which was tikkun olam, which means to heal the world. So I became a teacher. I taught in New York City for a number of years, and I wasn't sure I was making the world better. I didn't have the words to describe it that I do now, but I felt like some of the things that I was being asked to do were very antithetical to making the world a better place. So, for example, the school that I taught in, both schools, I taught in two different schools, one in the Bronx and one in South Brooklyn. And both of them had very strict dress code rules that if, like, for instance, if a student were not wearing a belt, they had a 2-hour after school detention. Yes. Or if they were wearing the wrong color shoes, they were put in school suspension and didn't really get to learn with their classmates that day. And that's not the only things. It's just kind of very representative of these very small rules that I was supposed to enforce and often chose not to, that I didn't think were making the world better. So when my first child was born, I took a couple of years off from teaching to try and figure out what I was going to do to pursue justice and heal the world. And even though I hadn't really thought that I was making the world better, I very optimistically thought that if I got a doctorate, I could change education in some way and therefore make the world better. And it is hard. I'm still not sure that I am pursuing justice, but I am trying.
Okay.
So.
Okay, wonderful. And you got your doctorate from Columbia, I presume.
Yes, Indu and I got our doctorates together.
Okay, wonderful. Great, terrific. Thank you so much for that introduction. And over to you, Dr. Indira Vishwanathan. What about you? What was your journey? How did you get into teaching and teacher education?
Absolutely. So my journey wasn't as clear or as early, I guess, as Jenna's. I majored in economics for my bachelor's degree. And out of college, I got, by all sort of conventional measures, was a great job after college. I was the research assistant to the chief U.S. economist of a major investment bank, a prestigious bank. The work was interesting. It was intellectual. We survived a merger, all of this exciting things happening in the mid to late 90s in New York. And within 2 years of doing this work, while I enjoyed the intellectual parts of it, I saw firsthand, first of all, the culture within Wall Street, which certainly was not kind to women, was not kind to someone who looked like me. And that was very much along gender and race lines. It wasn't necessarily that it was specifically Hindu-phobic, but I definitely saw that I didn't really have any role models in this place. And when I asked myself, what is it that I'm contributing, very much along the lines of how Jenna was thinking, I realized that all I was doing was making rich people richer. And I asked myself, is this the contribution I want to make to the world? And, you know, within the context of that dharmic framework that you described, Kalyanji, my father taught me the principles that his father taught him, which was that in life you need to have passion and purpose as guided by Dharma. So passion-wise, this was intellectually, I was passionate about, you know, studying economics. I thought it was interesting. But in terms of my purpose in the world, I wasn't really fulfilling my purpose in the world. And so that became my journey, a sort of a swadhyaya, self-study. What is it that I want to do? What is the effect that I'm going to at least try to have in the world? And that led me towards education. So I made the switch to education, which is a decision that was not necessarily popular in our community. People, you know, were wondering, you know, you had this prestigious job, you have this degree from a prestigious institution in this field. Why would you change all of that to become a public school teacher? Why would you give that all up for, you know, what was, and some people even told me was essentially glorified babysitting because I was going into elementary school education, right? And so that's kind of like that turning point into it. And then what followed was 15 years in the field in various roles in education, school teacher. I was in India working for Teach for India. I saw how American educational ideas are deployed in India on the Indian context. That was also very eyebrow raising, to say the least. And then I came back and decided I was working in schools with IHV, the International Association for Human Values, the institutional seva limb of the art of living. And I saw the ways in which pranayama and meditation and yoga were being, again, deployed. So not used authentically, not by the art of living program, but by other programs in schools. And that led me to want to kind of investigate how Hinduism and how justice are situated in schools. And that led me to my doctorate and to my friend Jenna.
Okay, fantastic. So great. So let's start with the question here. You know, this, you know, I mean, clearly all of us are aware that sometimes this social justice conversation gets over, you know, crosses certain boundaries and is weaponized in certain ways to bring down, to shame certain people. And probably the most, you know, most recent example is the suspension of Whoopi Goldberg from the show. There's a show in the media in which she's now suspended for some time. It's like that the 2-hour timeout that Jenna was mentioning for wearing the belt the wrong way. Now, apparently Whoopi Goldberg said something and she's now suspended. I mean, at the outset, it does really seem like a kind of an extreme sort of censure and punishment just for people saying something, you know, and people say all kinds of things. So I wanted to ask Dr. Jenna Murray this question. Let's juxtapose the idea of making the world a better place, the idea of healing the world, healing this world, right? And then this phenomenon of shaming people publicly in the name of cancel culture, social justice, etc., etc. Give us a perspective on what you think is happening.
Sure. So for those of you who are unaware, these comments that Whoopi Goldberg made on The View were basically her saying that the Shoah, the Holocaust during World War II was not about race, because as she understands race in the United States in the late 20th and early 21st century, race is about Black and brown and white. And so she did not see it as being about race, but about humans being terrible to humans, or essentially it was white on white crime, which is an ignorant perspective. I don't think it was meant maliciously. You know, obviously as a Jewish person, I find that kind of ignorance and just lack of knowledge really horrifying. And also as a teacher, I find that ignorance and lack of knowledge just really horrifying. And so many people were angry about this. But what Whoopi Goldberg did is she, first she apologized. It wasn't a great apology, but she did it. And then she actually brought in people from the Jewish community, specifically the president of the ADL, to talk with her about what was happening. And what we call this in Judaism is teshuvah, or repentance. So it's not just about apologizing, but it's really doing the work to make, to restitution, to make things better with you and the wronged party. And it's teshuvah is the focus of our big holiday of the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, which is usually in September. But it's something that we try to practice all year round. So most Jewish people I know, actually, I don't think I know a single Jewish person who has stated that they were unhappy with the teshuvah that Whoopi Goldberg did. And that's what we want, right? When people do things wrong, we want them to really sincerely apologize and try and make restitution. So when ABC made the decision to suspend her for 2 weeks after she'd done this work to apologize and to essentially cancel her. That's not what we wanted. It's not what anybody I know or any reputable Jewish organization asked for. We want people to learn and understand and grow from their mistakes. And that's kind of what I see as making the world better, not canceling or completely writing off people for making mistakes that were not out of malice, but were out of ignorance.
Right. And in fact, Jenna, from moving from ignorance to knowledge, is one of the central tenets of Sanatana Dharma, Hindu Dharma, which is to say that, we're all kind of ignorant in various ways. And it is impossible to know everything. I mean, it is impossible even to know what there is to know, what all there is to know. And we are situated fundamentally in knowing a little bit, but mostly ignorant about a lot of things, right? And this movement from ignorance to knowledge, even the very acknowledgement that maybe I was wrong in my position or my statement, is a profound sort of restitution in a way of speaking, right? It sort of acknowledges that something was not right about what I did. But this public shaming and punishing, just like there is almost like a desire to punish, which is somehow become a kind of a part of this culture of justice, the social justice movement. I want to learn more about what are the internal critiques within the social justice conversation itself about this. Okay, so let me begin on that note with Dr. Indira Vishwanath and get a perspective from her. Over to you.
Sure, thank you. I think what Jenna was describing, and there's a little sort of addendum, I think, to Jenna's story that you've shared with me, Jenna, that I think is worthwhile to add before I answer your question, Kalyanji. Maybe Jenna, if you want to just add that little bit.
Which part?
the part about, once she was taken off the air, the accusations that were made.
Okay, so I think one of the things about anti-Semitism is that it positions Jews as being responsible for pulling the strings behind the scenes. In capitalistic societies, Jews are held responsible for capitalism. In communist societies, Jews are held responsible for communism. All the stereotypes have us running the banks, running the government, running Hollywood, running the media, which is really, we're 0.2% of the population. I'm not sure how we're doing that because we're not. And so one of the things that happened was that even though no Jewish person that I know wanted Whoopi Goldberg suspended, when she was, which was a corporate decision, probably to just try and make the situation go away, the conversation in a lot of spaces, in particular social justice spaces, turned it into Jews oppressing a Black woman and canceling her, and that the Jews were responsible for it, even though that's not what happened.
Yeah. So I think first that's really, really important just for everyone to kind of know and recognize. But I think to come back to your question, Kalenji, I think what that kind of indicates or is illustrative of is how, because race and religion are so deeply and capitalism or the culture of economy in the US are so interwoven and meshed, it's almost a Gordian knot. Everything kind of gets reduced to the same exact analysis every single time, right? And so this is what's happened in this situation where the issue is really around religion, although Jews were racialized as a different race during the Holocaust, and that was a part of Whoopi Goldberg's ignorance. In contemporary times, the Jewish people are all racialized as white, and so then it was seen as a white act against, even though the issue is actually around religious persecution and a misunderstanding of a particular religious history. And so I think what that is this sort of veil and it's a very thin veil that masks the religious origin of social justice culture, right? And I think that's where you start to see a lot of these symptoms that you're describing of punishing, of public shaming, of retributive justice instead of, what Jenna's describing and what a lot of Indigenous traditions have, which is restorative justice. So yeah, a wrong has happened, but the action to take society forward and to heal is for everyone to come together and to restore the disharmony that's been created by the injustice, right? But instead we revert to these very almost stereotypical or these very archetypical manifestations of a very Christian practice of, what do you do when something wrong happens in society, of Christian morality and how to handle it. So there's the public shaming. There's even the public self-flagellation, right? You have to publicly announce, all the wrongs that you've done in front of everyone and kind of beat yourself up in front of everyone. It's all very public. There is the canceling, which means you're discarding, you're casting someone outside of society. There are the people who are in charge of judging, right? And then there's one set of commandments, one set of rules, and there's no argument about that. That's it. There isn't dissent. There isn't multiple ways of understanding how life is actually more about moral dilemma than it is about moral certitude, right? It's all very black and white. This is right, this is wrong, and there's no actual, whereas life shows us that it's actually very, very gray. There's a lot of moral dilemma. And, to your point earlier, Kalenji, like all of everything, our itihasas are everything that has been encoded in how we think about life is all about moral dilemma and about dialogue and discourse and growing and understanding how to navigate moral dilemma. I mean, the Bhagavad Gita is an entire treatise or conversation on moral dilemma. And so I think you see that black and whiteness that is now manifesting as race is actually a kind of manifestation of the black and whiteness of the Christian theology that sits beneath social justice.
Interesting. So, you brought up three things there. Okay, in terms of justice and injustice, right? There is economic injustice, right? There is economic injustice, which means large sections of the human population are economically extremely under-empowered, or disempowered is the right word, economically disempowered. Then there is the racial injustice, which is, to go back to what Dr. Jenna Murray was describing, even though today it might be in the popular consciousness, it might be convenient to associate the Jewish race with the white race, which is what, in a manner of speaking, Whoopi did in her whatever story she was telling. But in the run up to the Holocaust, it was completely a racist conversation. It was the Aryan race versus the Semitic race, and that polarity was very much in play for well over 100 years before the actual events unfolded in Germany. And then, of course, the religious. There is the Christian and the non-Christian, Christian and the non-Christian, which is religious kind of polarity here. So what you're saying, Induji, is that you're saying that somehow, even though this manifests in three different formulations, economic injustice, racial injustice, and religious injustice, what is behind all of this is the Christian religion. It seems to be that is the claim you are making here. Okay, and I'd like both a comment from you as well as a comment from Dr. Jenna Murray on this topic.
Okay. So I think I want to start with what I know, which is the field of education. And so most of what is the origin of social justice teacher education in the United States and in other places, but I'm going to speak to the United States because, again, that's what I know, comes from critical pedagogy, which was kind of popularized by Henry Giroux and Peter McLaren, who are two white men, who drew from Paulo Freire in South America. And Paulo Freire and his work, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, drew on Catholic liberation theology. And the way that liberation theology works is that human beings are supposed to draw inspiration from God, from the Trinity, as liberators from external oppression and from internalized oppressions, and therefore lead others out of their own oppression. So I think there is something to be said about like white men adopting this sort of pedagogical work, white men who I assume are at least culturally Christian, if not like overtly religiously Christian. And then popularizing that as social justice work in the United States. And so it's this implicit understanding that teachers are supposed to be liberators, that there is this binary between the oppressors and the oppressed, and that is your only position all the time, that you are either always an oppressor or always an oppressed person, and that, you know, there's no, again, no gray areas. It's always one or the other. And so that sort of Christian Catholic understanding of social justice has always been there. It's been implicit. And I think when you try to critique that, people don't want to hear it because it hasn't been explicated very well. People are like, oh yes, liberation Jenna, theology is a thing.
Yeah, so very quickly, right?
Yes.
The language of the oppressor and the oppressed is very Marxist, you know, and see, the thing is, See, where it confuses everybody, I mean, including me, I also get confused about this, is that, the language of oppressor and the oppressed was put in place, set in motion by Marxist writings in the middle of the 1800s, 1850s, 1860s, and so on. But Marx was also very anti-religious. He called religion the opium of the people, right? Very famously.
Yes.
So at least in our thinking, right, in our understanding, the language of the oppressor and the oppressed, it tends to get traced back to Marx and his writings, which is primarily economic oppressor and oppression. But it is unclear, it's not so easily clear to us that it has a theological foundation, as you are speaking about, which is, so did liberation theology use Marxist thought and exploit Marxist thought to introduce these ideas from a liberation perspective? Okay. Or was it Christian theology already in play that underlay Marxist thought? I mean, this is a very peculiar situation here. What do you think?
I'm not sure I'm willing to give credit to one coming first or the other coming first. I think that both Catholicism and sort of Marxist thinking were in place in South America when Freire was doing his work. And so I think we are all influenced by predominating thoughts and epistemologies in the times and places in which we are living. So it doesn't surprise me that much of this, that there is an influence with each other. And I think based on, what was happening, we can say that, yes, they're both there, but I don't think it's necessarily fair or productive to say Christian theology came first and then Marxism came first, or like liberation theology was born out of Marxism. I think it's just all mixing all around us. And like we all do, we take things out of what we understand and what we live and how we make sense of the world.
Right. Okay, great. All right, terrific. Okay, Indu, your perspective on this topic, please.
Sure, Jenna, I just want to make sure you had a chance to finish. You were finished from earlier? Okay. Yeah, I appreciate what both of you were just saying. I would say that I think some of this interplay between Marxism and what was happening in the sort of Latin American reaction to Catholicism, liberation theology, Freire, all of it. If you look at the origin of this country, it very much is this very messy mix of economics, religion, and race, right? So you steal, you kidnap, you enslave indigenous African people, steal them to this country. You steal the land of indigenous people of this land. You forcibly convert them, and you use religion to justify exploiting them for free labor to build your economy. So at the origin of the country, this is the origin story of the country, right? And so because that's the root, that's the foundation upon which the country is built. To Jenna's point, whatever is happening in the Americas, so in South America, and this battle between Catholicism and Protestantism, all of these things that are happening in North America, in the United States, and the ways in which race and economy are intertwined with all of it, because all of it was based on trade and plantations and economic development, right? I think that's probably why you have this sort of heady mix of things that sound both Marxist and Christian theological, and
okay.
so yeah.
So I think it's fair to say then that these three strands, the economic arguments, primarily emerging from the Marxist reaction to capitalism in Europe, Christian theology, which tends to turn everything into a black and white conversation, the saved and the damned and so on, the ones who are in and the ones who are out and so on. And I hate to use the word phrase black and white because that brings up the racial dimension, which is the racial ordering of the people in this world, and the concern about do I belong more with the white people, or do I belong more with the black people? Where am I in the scale of racial ordering? That is another internal concern. And these three strands of thought are getting intermixed in ways that are very difficult to untangle at the moment. Is that a fair? And it's very confusing for people as they recognize what is really going on here. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it's fair. I think what makes it even more complicated is, to Jenna's point from earlier, this kind of unwillingness or hesitation or confusion around really addressing the Christianity in the room. Mm-hmm. I think you're also talking about a country that is growingly immigrant. And so you have, and particularly from, while formerly the largest growing group of immigrants was from South America, so converted to Christianity already, now you have more immigrants coming from Asia and different parts of Asia. So parts of Asia that are Christian, parts of Asia that are not Christian, right? So, Indian Americans make up the most religiously different group of immigrants because we are the largest non-Christian immigrant group in the country. And the largest growing immigrant population is Asian American, right? And so because you're coming with all these different histories from the global South and different global Souths, the global South is not a monolith, I think that makes it even more complicated, right? Because when you're coming from that history, and okay, this is where it starts to get you start to see the circuits. American social justice is one of its imperialist exports, right? Mm-hmm. So American history and a particular version of American history is used to inform the theorization of social justice, but that theorization is then exported as a technology and as a technocracy outside to the rest of the world. To my point earlier about Teach for India, what's born in and of here is then sort of seen as a pill that can then be, delivered and ingested by people around the world. And so then you have that kind of complicating and mapping over very different histories in other parts of the world and people immigrating from there to here, right? And so you have this idea of what the US is being implanted in immigrants' minds in their home countries and their motherlands, coming here and thinking, well, that's what's happening here. And so that makes for very, very complicated and confusing conversations, dialogues. We're talking across each other. We might even be using the same words, but we're not actually having the same conversations.
Okay. Yeah. Great. Okay. So now let's move to another conversation here. Now, as teachers, right, as educators of teachers and as teachers, right, it is understandable that we want to impart to the younger generation an appropriate sensitivity to the phenomenon of injustice in this world, so that they recognize it, understand it, and are and in their own time, in their life, they deal with it in some responsible and sensitive way. Okay, so I'm just going to leave it at that. But the question I'm asking is the curriculum working today to enable that kind of sensitivity and responsibility in the younger generation? And if so, how is it working? And where is it going off the rails, if it is going off the rails? Your views, please.
So I think it might have the possibility of working, if only because people seem very terrified by it. In ways that where you see across the United States, we're having books banned. We are seeing these statewide and district bans on so-called critical race theory. But if you ask the people who are making these bans, what they mean is it's not critical race theory as an academic theory, which is really complex and can't be taught really to elementary school children in the way that they think it's being taught. What people mean is that they're scared of having actual history taught of the United States in a way that is real, in a way that like actually encapsulates what happened here, as opposed to this very sanitized, white people came from Europe and saved the country and expanded across the West and made it amazing. And
civilized it, right?
Yeah, and civilized it, exactly.
Right.
And that, I think the fact that these bans are sprouting all over the place, including there is a bill in the state of Ohio where I am currently that would ban it. It's not there yet, but it would also ban it in higher education, meaning that I wouldn't be able to do the work that I do at a state-funded institution. So I think it could work if there were space for it, but there are a lot of people who are really scared by it and who are not making the space for it currently.
Okay. Great. Indu?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. One, I think again, what I see the reaction to the sort of perceived this panic around, what happens if this gets taught in schools, is this idea, again, it goes back to this idea of like, I don't want my child to be shamed in school for being white, right? So it goes back to this whole like the original sin of being white. And that's what's happening in schools, and they're going to be shamed for something that they didn't do because they were never slave owners. So why should they be taught this, right? And so it's, let's obscure what happened in the past because I don't want my child to be publicly shamed, when actually what we're looking at is truth and reconciliation. We cannot move forward and do something, build something different in the future if we don't reconcile with what happened in the past. And I think a lot of Hindus and immigrant Hindus can really relate to that, can really, really relate to how important and how difficult that process is and complicated it is, but how absolutely necessary that process is. You can't move forward if you keep papering over the past. It doesn't mean that you're caught in the past, but it also means that you have to kind of look at it. And sort of speaking to something you said earlier in your question, this idea that we are introducing children to the concept of injustice, I think, is something for us to really examine. Any parent knows that a child at a very early age will say that's not fair when it comes to their own life, when it comes to rules that they perceive to be enacted by their parents differently between them and their siblings, or but their teacher did it differently for them and their friends. Studies show that kids see when rules are, young children see when rules are applied unevenly to children of different genders or races. So they perceive inequity, they see it. And the issue really is when we don't teach to it, they're internalizing that as okay, right? And so this idea that we're feeding children ideas that they're not ready for and that we're exposing them to things too early, I think is something that we really need to sit with and to reflect on, and to not, I think there's this perception that people think that these videos of Target being vandalized is what's being taught to young children in schools. And that's the furthest thing from the truth, right? That's not what's happening. What is happening is teaching children to first articulate the injustices that they're seeing, to perceive what's happening around them, and to start thinking about, well, what kind of person do I want to be in the world? What kind of citizen do I want to be? What's the purpose of a democracy? Is being a citizen more than just voting? How do I have the rights that I have right now? If you're a young girl, knowing that, in the past you wouldn't have had the right to vote in this country, how did that come to pass? How is that complicated? The same in terms of, if you are a child of interracial marriage, how 2 generations ago you wouldn't have been possible, that was illegal. So understanding how that came to pass. So a deep appreciation for the ways in which things have come to be, the mechanisms that allowed these things to happen was not just because equity is correct, not just because justice is the right thing, but because people took action around it. And also how that progression isn't always linear, and how things are recursive and move in spirals, and we can move backwards and forwards, and how we kind of understand that. So I think it's just really recognizing and seeing the world as a lot more complicated. Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, I think for a moment, you made the argument that young people, young children in school are more than able to deal with complexity. It's what you're saying, essentially, that
Yes.
they are more able to deal with complexity than the adults give them credit for, so to speak, right? The idea of truth and reconciliation, as you have articulated, has some potential, even in the K through 12 level of education, where the objective is not so much to make white children guilty, shame them, or to make black children or non-white children angry and vengeful, and in some ways self-righteously so, right? I mean, so this is the complex nuance that this education in this domain has to traverse, right? That's what it seems to me, right? And of course, as you said, people are terrified about it. They're terrified about it. They want to cancel it. They want to kill it. They want to not allow any of this to happen in the schools. Instead, the sanitized version of, as you said, how it is just so wonderful. The white people came across from Europe and civilized this place, and now we have modern civilization, which can be exported to the rest of the world. The rest of the world should now copy the West and become like the West, so that then they can also be civilized, etc. And so the whole conversation of justice, social justice itself, is now polarized into these different sort of perspectives on what it is and how to go about it. I mean, that's what it seems to me. Now, the question I have is this: the truth and reconciliation, as you articulated, does it have any potential in this acrimonious, polarized world? I mean, do we have any real examples of this really happening in a constructive and transformative way? I mean, Dr. Jenna first, and then Dr.
So I think, I can't speak to like large scale governmental forms of it, but there was for a while, I think pre-COVID, a pretty intense movement towards implementing restorative justice in schools rather than retributive justice. Unfortunately, I don't think it was implemented very well in most places. I think it's really hard for people to remove themselves from a mindset of like an act and then a punishment for that act. And I think it requires a level of sensitivity and care and understanding to implement appropriately that, it's really hard to do with people who haven't really examined their feelings and understandings about justice. And so it wasn't always implemented very well. There are a few schools that have done some pretty good work around it where, really the idea is to have someone who has done something wrong, apologize and really understand and make it up to whoever was wronged. So that is something that could be done, but like lots of things, it requires people to really critically examine themselves, critically examine the structures that are already in place. It's not something that you can sort of Tetris block into already existing systems. It's an entirely different paradigm. Mm-hmm. So when we live in the United States, where our we have the highest rate of incarcerated people in the world, where incarceration is seen as a very valid form of punishment for things. It's really hard to critically examine that mindset and that system and do something different. So there needs to be a lot of self-examination, social examination, better understandings of the world and how it works in order to make this kind of thing happen on a larger scale.
Yeah, great. That's a great point, Jenna, that there's got to be a lot of self-understanding, self-examination and introspection before you can even deploy something like this, because it is so, it is so divisive. And it is, unless we bring a level of maturity and the kind of nuance that's required is more than what most people are able to muster. I mean, it just seems like that, except in small pockets. Maybe this is at the current moment in time pretty hard to implement. Dr. Indu, your thoughts on this truth?
Sure, I think
yeah,
absolutely. I think places specifically in teacher ed and education where you've seen this kind of, I'm not going to say it's a success, and I'm not even going to say it's possible to do it in the same way, but you've seen some movements towards truth and reconciliation in countries where they have standing truth and reconciliation commissions. Mm-hmm. So South Africa, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. So in those places where there's a standing commission, whereas the US only had, I think, a very temporary one about a specific issue, those countries actually have standing commissions. Then you start to see it kind of have an influence on institutional places like education. So there you start to see some kind of, once you start to recognize, and the thing about these truth and reconciliation commissions is that they're recognizing the harm done to the indigenous people and the indigenous way of holding the land. Now, I'm not at all saying that these are enacted perfectly or that there aren't major issues, and then in some cases this might even just be lip service, but it's headed in a direction that we're not headed to in any substantial way in the United States, which is recognizing the indigenous knowledge tradition and approach, right, to being on that specific land. And in those cases, you do see a lot. I mean, when I was looking at truth and reconciliation, when I was doing my literature review for my dissertation, when I was looking at truth and reconciliation in teacher ed, there was nothing in the United States of substance. Everything came from those countries. And again, there, a lot of the work, as Jenna's describing in teacher ed, really is that self-examination. That's it's so much of it is self-study, because it's very, very easy to talk about these things, but then when push comes to shove, everyone just auto-corrects to retributive justice because that's what they're seeing around them. And until that autocorrect changes, until the inclination is to step back and say, no, actually, we're actually going to, like, the right thing, the thing that feels like progress is not punishing this person, but is to actually think about this in a different way. I think it is possible. Now, while I was working with Yes for Schools, we were working with a program within a public school in Newark, New Jersey. And this school had, this program was sort of like a last attempt at rehabilitating these kids that were otherwise, probably they had been in juvie a couple of, once or twice, and once they aged out of the system, they were likely going to end up in the prison system, right? But this was a last attempt within the school, and so they brought in our program, and our teachers showed up every single day, and they didn't, you can't force anyone to meditate or do pranayama or anything, but they showed up every single day for months and months. And over the course of 4 months, suspensions and detentions for those kids dropped by 90%. And well, that's a kind of like a happy number to report to our funders. I wanted to find out why that was happening. And so I went and spoke with the teachers. And when I spoke with the teachers, over time, those kids had really changed. Their hoodies came down, their headphones came off, and they were asking for meditation because the teachers had simply shown up and were in their presence, and they were meditators themselves. And the space had softened. You could feel it, that the space had softened. And when someone made a mistake, the teachers said, when someone in our classroom makes a mistake, we call them in and we find out what's going on for them. We don't push them out and give them detention, right? And so the entire concept of who the classroom, what made up the classroom and what the purpose of the classroom had shifted. And so these kids, instead of being pushed out of school, and we know that detention doesn't work, suspension doesn't work, expulsion doesn't work, right? You did see this shift. Now, of course, the amount of time and energy that our teachers had put into this was massive, and they are, they had their own practice of sadhana of 2 hours a day before they even went into these classrooms. So that's not necessarily something that you can scale and replicate, but these things are possible. These different ways of being and thinking about the classroom are entirely possible.
Great, fabulous. So just a quick question, Dr. Jenna, for you. From a Jewish perspective, has there ever been an adequate level of attention paid to the possibilities of truth and reconciliation? And what is your view on that?
So I do want to clarify that I am coming from a particular denominational view. There are multiple denominations of Judaism. I personally practice the Reform denomination, which is in a lot of ways much more liberal, much less orthodox, and much less allowing for personal critical thinking in terms of like what and why we do particular things. So with that said, I mean, no, like I live in the United States, and I live in Ohio specifically. I lived in New York for a long time. And I think in both places, there is very much this idea that with transgression must come retribution. And that is what justice is. And, I've worked on some like faith-based activism where we've tried to change that at the state level, where we've tried to get a ban on the death penalty in the state of Ohio, where we have tried to move drug crimes into, rather than like imprisonment, into treatment and like community-based reconciliation. It hasn't worked. So no, I think it is very much something that, again, people need to really critically examine the way they see the world and why they see the world that way. Like, why is it so important that punishment be meted out for crimes, and particularly to certain people more so than others? And I think that's also a really important thing for us to examine. Like, why should a Black person who grew up in poverty be more punished for the same drug crime than my neighbor across the street, who is white and wealthy? They got to go to rehab, like that. And this is true. Like this actually happened. So why is it that way? Like, why do we feel that some people are more deserving of punishment than others? And why are we punishing at all? And I think that is something that needs to happen. And because of where I live, it's not going to happen, because I think implicitly and explicitly, like, Ohio is very, very, very conservative Christian. And that is very much a belief of conservative Christians, that transgression demands retribution and judgment, but only for some people. So I don't see it having been attempted in a way that aligns with how I see the world here. In other places, I don't know, but here, no.
No. Yeah. And Dr. Indu, are you optimistic about truth and reconciliation from your perspective?
I think where I'm optimistic comes from what I see as a greater people are feeling, how do I say this? My sense is that there is probably a large number of people who are feeling disenfranchised by both extremes, by the far left and the far right. And I think it's really in that middle. And you can think of that as political, you can think in so many ways. And I think there are really interesting and rich and nuanced conversations happening in the middle. And that middle, I think, is much larger actually than either extreme. Both extremes are very loud, they're very noisy. And I think if we maybe put less attention on the things that we don't want to grow, and put some more attention on this middle and really have these conversations where we're calling people into conversations. We're not calling out, we're calling in. I think there is hope for that. And I think what actually gives me the most hope are my conversations with children, whether they're young children or even my own teenagers. They're able to talk about these things with so much more nuance and so much more clarity and care and compassion, because they're talking about their peers, they're talking about what's happening around them, and they're talking about their own future that they're building. They have a lot more skin in the game. I think that's really, really what gives me hope. I think it would behoove us to all kind of be a little bit more quiet and listen more closely to young people.
Yeah, it's a great point. So I think that point has been very well made, that there is a level of nuance and a level of conversation and dialogue that is possible in the middle that is getting literally destroyed and stamped out at the extremes. And insofar as we get trapped in one extreme or the other, no matter how we arrive at that extreme intellectually, we're missing out on the possibilities of truth, reconciliation, of just the possibility of justice and transformation. So, do we want to take a few questions now, or shall we end the webinar? So let's take a few questions, okay? Maybe a few minutes. So here is a very first question. People, if you want to ask a question, put it in the question and answer box, okay? So we're not going to take questions from the chat window. Sorry. So here's a question. I'm enjoying the discussion on punitive versus restorative justice. I'm thinking about the internal criticisms within the Hindu community, and being passive or overly forgiving is identified as a fatal flaw. Is there value in Hindu Americans engaging in punitive justice to make our discontent and perspective more visible? I mean, this is coming obviously from a sense of being deeply injured by this social justice conversation, where Hindus are suddenly transformed into oppressors broadly, and congenitally so. And therefore, there's a lot of annoyance about that. So, Dr. Indu, your perspective on this.
Well, I think the being passive or overly forgiving is actually this discomfort with actually speaking the truth. So I don't think it's about whether or not we're being sort of strong enough, because oftentimes there's this overcorrection of the passivity with kind of being very punitive. But I think, again, those are two extremes. And I think where we can be more bold is not in striking out, but in speaking out and speaking truth, and not being, a large reason why we are narrated the way we are in the world is because our own history has been papered over, and we are we're hesitant and apologetic, and we kind of often, I hear people spiritually bypass even over just plainly speaking our history. And because of that, that history doesn't exist in the public consciousness at all. And so we're operating from a false history of what's happening to us. So when I say history, it's as recent as yesterday, not just in the past, but what's happening now. And so I think that's kind of the step. I think that's the response I would say to this being passive is in speaking truth, not in engaging in something punitive that's outside of our schema. I think that's still a very colonized reaction. It's you're becoming the colonizer, I think, if that's your approach.
Wow. Okay. All right. So let's take another question here. Vijay Joseph is asking a bunch of questions, but it seems like you are Mr. Vijay Joseph. You are expressing a very Christian view here in your questions. So let's see. Let's take one question. What explains the existence of injustice, including racial justice, both racial injustice, both historical and contemporary, in parts of the world that are non-Christian and non-white? Of course, you know the anyway. Let me give this to both Dr. Jenna and Indu for a moment, and then I'll weigh in on this.
I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that question. I think we have seen throughout history that there is a sense of safety in tribalism and in being with people who are like you. You know, I speak only for myself when I say that I am much more comfortable living in neighborhoods where there are more Jewish people. I am much more comfortable in Jewish spaces rather than in non-explicitly Jewish spaces. Well, no, that's not true. I am not comfortable in spaces that are implicitly Christian spaces, but are not explicitly Christian. Because there is something to be said about being with people who are like you. And I think that's taken oftentimes to fear and disdain of people who are not like you. And I don't think that is necessarily based on religious beliefs or on race or on class. I think it's just human nature.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer like why in all of human history does injustice exist.
Perfect. So
I mean, if I were to add to that, I would just say because people are going to people. Like these are small-mindedness is the tendency of the human mind, and that's why we have knowledge, and that's why we have gurus, and that's why we have all of the things in place. And in terms of, you know, why is that racialized even when it's not white? It's because race has been applied to the histories of the rest of the world by white supremacists in order to, you know, make the world in their image. So it's not inherently racist. It's just the ways in which we're narrating it. But in terms of injustice, like the reason there is injustice is because there's imbalance in the world, and there's always, I mean, harmony is not a static thing. It's an active thing. You have to work towards harmony, right?
Right. Perfect. And in fact, Jenna, just one quick comment about, see, people preferring to live within communities that are that they are comfortable with, meaning that they are you know, like our own people, you know, and being comfortable, you said, was quite normal. It's human nature to do that. What is not human nature is to go out and plunder the next community, next, you know, adjacent community, take their possessions, rewrite their history, and you know, dehumanize the entire world, which is who Mr. Vijay Joseph is defending on this in his comments in the chat window. See, the problem is if you leave others alone, you know, there's a reasonable chance you'll be left alone. But when you're not being left alone, when there is this tremendous intrusive philosophy of life, or whatever it is, that allows theological foundations that demands that the whole world be Christian in some way, whether it is explicitly or implicitly, right? That's the source that where there's a lot of these challenges come into the forefront. Okay, now let's. I'm going to take a question from Parth Parihar. So let's see. Connecting the earlier discussion on Whoopi Goldberg to that on CRT, critical race theory, it seems like many people are drawing false assumptions about what must be being taught in schools today. What must be being taught in schools today? Example, public shaming, demonization as a function of the cancellation they observe happening in the real world. What do you think underlies this way of thinking, and how can we work to make our public discourse more reasonable? Complex question. Yeah, who wants to take it? Indu, Jenna, who wants to take that?
So I used to teach high school English, and now a lot of my professional responsibility is educating future high school and middle school English teachers. And I have to say, it's interesting, this idea that public shaming and demonization is being taught today versus in the past, in concert or in response to what you're seeing in the real world. So I'm not sure that's the case. I didn't want to teach like high school English for 11th grade here in the US, because it's all American and United States literature. And I think pretty much everything that's in the canonical curriculum up to 1920 is really kind of centered around this sort of demonization and public shaming. And like the Scarlet Letter, for example, is a very, very, very classic piece of literature that is taught in most US schools. And that is entirely about public shaming and demonization. And how long has that been taught? So I do have to wonder if that is a conversation that is being had by people who don't remember school, because that is something that is probably not ever going to be taken out of the US English curriculum, that talks about public shaming and demonization, and it talks about the problems with it for sure, but somehow that part doesn't necessarily get addressed. So I don't know if that's a new thing in US society, or if that is reflecting US society from when it was first colonized, and that's reflected in the literature, but I don't know if it's necessarily something that's new, and I'm not necessarily sure that discourse can be changed in such a way that'll combat that, when that's been a part of the curriculum for a very, very long time and has always been there. I don't know, Indu, if you want to add to that.
I agree with you. I think also there is this perception, one, that schools can solve society, and that's a lot of burden to put on schools. I think maybe I'm reading Parth's question a little bit different. I thought his question was around the sort of perception of what's happening in schools, reflecting what's happening kind of on social media versus the reality of what's happening in schools, and how can we make society more like what's actually happening in schools, which appears to be more reasonable. So that's kind of how I read the question. Yeah. And I think I think what underlies this way of thinking is that people project a lot onto schools. They see schools as microcosms of society and the place for society to be solved, to come and dump all your problems there and solve it with as little funding and support as possible. Please solve all the problems. And how to make our public discourse more reasonable, I would say, is just more meeting in the middle, more actual conversations. I do think there are some really interesting things to learn from different our concepts of debate, and especially online debate, are very polemical and come from a very particular onto-epistemology, very particular cultural background. And I think there's a lot we can learn from debate and discourse from other traditions. You know, we have some 40+ different versions of debate in our tradition, which, you know, what I find to be most powerful is the respect behind debate. The debate is not always polemical. It is really often about the pursuit of an intellectual pursuit of understanding things better through discourse, through debate. And so beginning a conversation with, in a reasonable way, saying, this is what I understand your perspective to be, this is what I understand you to see as the issue, am I correct? Before you even begin saying your point of view, versus completely, what happens now is completely intentionally mischaracterizing what the other person is saying in order to land your point, right?
Yeah.
So I think there are a lot of things that we can do better. Now, of course, you can model that, and not everyone else is going to do it. So, you know, how do we create spaces for that type of thing to happen? And certainly we can teach that in schools too.
And the uphill struggle is if teachers are trying to model this kind of middle space where, you know, where dialogue can happen. But the models of public leadership in America is completely modeling something, giving a different example. It is a struggle to, you know, because it seems so easy to get polarized, and somebody trying to polarize so sharply in the chat window right now. But we will end this call today, in this webinar today. So I just want to thank both Dr. Jenna Murray and Dr. Indira Vishwanath for participating in today's webinar. And thank you for your insights. I really hope that, you know, in some measure, teachers are the future of any society, because they shape the young minds, and it's important that we find that appropriate nuance and maturity in these conversations, instead of so easily getting polarized on either side of this, the two different extremes of this debate. So on that note, thank you so much, everybody. Namaste, and have a wonderful rest of the Sunday. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.